Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. On this week's show, we're bringing you a collection of some of our most popular stories. We do want to mention, as United States and global health officials continue to assess the spread of COVID-19, UNL is monitoring the situation. Updates can be found at the address on your screen and on the Market Journal website. So beginning today's show, have you got milk? Because with calving season winding down for many, it's important to make sure the newest cows get all the nutrition and protection they need. That's where colostrum comes in. Market Journal's Mattie McIntosh talked with an expert to find out what exactly colostrum is and why it's so important to calves.
With calving season in full swing, producers need to make sure they're setting their calves up for success from the moment they enter the world. And the best way to do that is by ensuring they get their fair share of colostrum before the day is done.
Colostrum is the first milk that is produced by the mother cow or dam. It's extremely complex and it has important immune factors, important nutrients. Colostrum is about 22% solids compared to 12% solids of normal whole milk. Much of this extra solid is immunoglobulins, but cow colostrum also contains energy, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. Immunoglobulins are antibodies that give that calf that first protection for common diseases and also infections. When they are inside the cow, the immunoglobulins are such large molecules that they cannot pass through the placenta to the calf, so there's no immune transfer from the cow to the calf. So when that calf is born, it's born without any immunity, and it needs to get immunity from the environment for common diseases and also infection. So that's the importance of colostrum.
Not only does a producer need to make sure a calf gets enough colostrum, but that it receives it in a timely manner in order to ensure that it absorbs the antibodies needed to fight off infection and disease.
So ideally, the calf will be up and nursing within an hour and consume 5 to 6% within 6 hours and the same amount by 12 hours. So for an 80-pound calf, that's 2 to 2.5 quarts per feeding, and by 12 hours old, that calf should have consumed at least a gallon of colostrum. By the time that calf is 24 hours old, very, very low percent of antibodies can pass across that intestine to the calf. So that's the reason that it's very important.
While getting colostrum from the calf's mother is the best, it may not always be an option. Walz says not to worry, as there are alternatives you can use, and storing it is easier than you think.
You know, if you need to have other sources, you can get colostrum from other mature cows in your herd. You could purchase some or get some from somewhere else, but you have to be careful. Make sure you get it from healthy cows. Talk with your veterinarian and consult with him to find out what will be the best for your ranch with experience that he has. And a lot of times, maybe when we have gathered some colostrum, we want to freeze that, and we can freeze it, and it will keep well in the freezer for up to a year. And one nice, easy way is if you use a gallon Ziploc bag and fill it half full, that will be 2 quarts. If you lay it flat, it will store easily and you can stack other things on top of it, and you have an increased surface area. So when you go to warm up that colostrum, it will warm up quicker. And never use boiling temperatures to warm that colostrum up, because that will break down the antibodies, and the antibodies are what's very important in colostrum. So use a warm water bath to warm up the colostrum, and if that water gets cool, just go ahead and add more hot water to that.
And when it comes down to it, Walz says it's better to be safe than sorry.
And there may be times where you're unsure if that calf received colostrum, and you can go ahead and feed that calf colostrum. Maybe you have to milk out the dam, or if you have colostrum on hand, you can bottle feed that calf or use an esophageal feeder. But just remember that you need to get that colostrum into that calf within that first 24 hours, so you can have a good shot at making it to weaning and going on, and there will not be any sickness with that animal.
For more information on colostrum, you can go to beefwatch.unl.edu or contact your local extension office. Next up, when you're out looking at your field, it's easy to focus on the crops and forget that soil matters more than we even realize. Made up of air, water, minerals, and organic material, it's one of the most important natural resources on Earth. Dr. Andrea Basche is an assistant professor in UNL's Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. She joined me on the show to give some background on her work and even brought a pretty cool demonstration too.
So I have a background both in agronomy and climate science, and the research I've done has really focused on understanding crop and soil management strategies to help reduce climate risks. And cover crops has been one thing that I've studied a lot as a climate risk reduction tool. As I started to study more about climate change impacts on agriculture and food production, I got very interested in the soil and seeing that as an adaptation solution. And we hear a lot about people who are thinking about, increased food demand over the next upcoming decades with, increased population. But I really think a lot about the soil and what's our soil resource going to look like by 2050. And that's actually what I'm really excited to show on the show today, that on a positive note, the way we manage our soil can make a big difference on our outcomes.
So kind of remind our viewers why soil health is so important.
Right, so if you think about soil health like human health, if we don't have our own health, then what do we have, right? So typically when we think about soil health, that term tends to take into account the physical, biological, and chemical properties of the soil. And the biological properties, really the living organisms in the soil, so the microbes, the earthworms, how alive is the soil, that's the biology. The chemistry being, how well is your soil cycling nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus. The physical aspects of the soil being things like how well does the soil structure allow plant roots to grow, how much water can be stored. So if you can say yes to all of those questions, then that really is an indicator that you have healthy soil. And what that means for producers is that you're going to have a more productive soil in time that's better for your bottom line, and it also protects your soil resource into the future.
So we've talked about why soil health is so important, and we actually have a demonstration here. What are we looking at?
So what I hope the demonstration will illustrate is just a few different ways that we manage soil and what those outcomes are. And in particular, this is going to demonstrate the infiltration rate of the soil, which means the rate at which water enters the soil, which is so important when we think about getting more of these heavy rain event days. And it's something I've studied. It's something I've also heard a lot of farmers brag about or talk about, in particular some of the cover crop farmers that I know. They love to tell these stories about that day that there was a 5-inch rain event and their soil just soaked up all the rain, but their neighbors had, water standing on their field for days after. So it's a really important aspect of how our soil functions. And so what we have here is soil from the Rogers Memorial Farm, which is a University of Nebraska research station. It's located about 10 miles east of Lincoln. And this soil is from a tillage experiment that's been going on since 1981. It's been managed by Paul Yassa in Extension. And so what we have here is a pretty simple setup. So we've got some beakers that we drilled some holes in the bottom of. We've got some containers to collect water, and we've got some vessels to simulate rainfall over our soil surface. And actually this amount of water is meant to represent about 1/2 inch of rain over this surface area. So the 3 soils that we have here, again, are all from Rogers Memorial Farm. The first one here is soil that has been from that tillage experiment that's been conventionally tilled or tilled with a moldboard plow in the fall and disked twice in the spring since 1981. So managed that way for 38 years.
Nice.
This soil in the middle is a no-till soil, so has not been disturbed at all in those 38 years. These are corn, soybean, crop rotations, dry land experiment. And then the third soil is actually from a grassed area, unfarmed, on the research station, where we just dug up some soil to try to demonstrate what's the difference when you have permanent roots in the soil as well.
So just some natural grass.
Yeah, some natural grass. Yeah, and so it's all the same soil type. It's a silty clay loam soil. All right, so you ready to help me, Troy?
All right,
help make it rain?
Let's do it.
Okay, so what we're going to be looking for is how quickly the water is moving through the soil. So, and really, the quicker that the water gets into the containers, the better that would be for water moving through the soil profile for where we'd want plant roots to access it versus running off and taking soil and nutrients with it.
Okay,
Okay?
so count of 3.
1,
Two,
2, 3.
three.
So you can see in the grassed and no-till soil that water's moving quite quickly through the profile. So you can see a lot of water coming out of the bottom here.
Oh yeah.
But you can also see in the conventionally tilled soil that there's less water coming out. It's moving more slowly.
Yeah,
and
and
then
it's pooling up
right,
too.
and you have the water collecting at
Yeah, it's
the top of the
really
beaker.
pooling up top.
Right, so in my own research, what I found is that cover crops, so again, continuous roots in the soil, can significantly increase infiltration rates, and they can also significantly increase the water that's stored in the soil. And actually, what Paul Yassa's long-term tillage experiment has found is that the no-till plots actually yield the highest consistently. This is right now a corn-soybean crop rotation.
And what are some things that producers can do in addition to cover crops to get healthy soil?
Right, so I would like to remind producers more about the principles of good soil management and soil health rather than just specific practices, right? So some of those principles that can be transferred to practices that might work in one area versus another are trying to minimize disturbance as much as possible, trying to use a diversity of crops and possibly integrating livestock, and also keeping living roots in the soil, so things like cover crops, perennial crops, et cetera. So thinking about those principles of good soil management.
So you've gone on record saying that a lot of attention is given to air quality, water quality, not so much or not as much with soil. So what is it that you'd like the public and farmers to be aware of?
Sure, I just think that point exactly, that we never hear about the imperative of soil, right? Soil is just the thin living skin of the earth. It's, you know, not a readily renewable resource, and the need to protect it is really vital. And so just the fact that we don't hear about it enough, in my opinion, I think. So I would say for producers, don't be afraid to remind people that you are stewards of the soil, and for the general public, you know, being more cognizant of the fact that we all depend on soil, you know, to eat 3 times a day.
Definitely. And we always hear stories about how climate change is impacting natural resources. How does that play out as far as soil goes?
Right. So one of the major climate impacts we are already experiencing and can continue to experience in this area is increased rainfall variability, right? So national estimates have found that for regions like the Northern Great Plains, Midwest, Northeast, that heavy rain events have increased over 30% relative to the earlier part of the 20th century. And so with those heavy rain events, you have a chance for increased soil erosion, you have the chance for increased soil degradation, which can lead to lower productivity. So those are 2 major impacts. And you know, when you think about the geologic time it takes to form soil, and we can appreciate that things like rainfall contribute actually to soil formation, they can also contribute to the degradation of soil. But estimates have found that for soil to form, and again, that's really just the breakdown of rock or movement of materials that become soil, that can happen at a rate of about 1/2 ton per acre per year. But when we think about some of the rain events we've had this year, there was actually a few days of rain in eastern Nebraska in early September where we got 6 inches of rain in a few days, and estimates of soil erosion loss for some parts of eastern Nebraska were 3 tons per acre. So if you think about 1/2 ton per acre per year formation, 3 tons of loss in just a few days, it's going to take years to form what we lost in just a few days. So we can lose soil that takes a long time to form in just a short amount of time. So some kind of sobering facts around the need for soil conservation with rainfall variability. But the good news is that we can see that the way we manage soil really does make a difference on outcomes from heavy rain events. And actually Nebraska leads the Corn Belt in the number of acres of no-till. It's estimated to be 50% of our cropped acres. Okay. A little bit less for cover crops. It's just about 2% of cropped acres. Those are numbers from the most recent ag census. We'll have some new data from that out in the spring, but you know, hopefully an increase in some of those things. But we can impact the future and what the growing rainfall variability means for our soil resource.
Thanks again to Andrea. Very good topic and pretty cool demonstration too. It's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And in place of our usual forecast, Al is here to tell us about another weather-related topic that we need to know. He joined me in the studio to discuss flooding risk. So with all the wetness issues that were prevalent during 2019, what is the latest on our flood risk going forward?
Well, as of the middle of March, the National Water Center put on a symposium in regards to flooding risk across all the upper Midwest. And if we recall back last fall, there was some releases by NOAA in regards to spring flooding risk, which is highly unusual based on what the precipitation regimes have been across most of the upper Midwest during 2019. So we had a lot of carryover moisture, and the concern was, of course, a repeat performance of the snow and the wet conditions that we've seen during the winter of 2018-2019 were repeat performance. So they issued this release, and the latest release, basically, if we look across all the basins of the upper Midwest, we're actually doing fairly good here, and a lot of that was a result of some very warm conditions between major precipitation events, allowing us to get rid of that surface moisture, and we didn't set the deep frost in the ground as we did last year.
So what river basins across the state carry the greatest risk of flooding going forward?
Well, according to the National Water Center, eastern Nebraska has about a 10 to 30% increase above its normal spring flood risk. If we go immediately up into extreme northeastern Nebraska, it takes in the eastern Dakotas, particularly the lower portion of the Missouri River Basin that comes in into southeastern South Dakota, and all the way up the Red River Valley, those have between a 30 and a 50% likelihood of seeing flooding. So we're much lower. Within Nebraska, the highest basins would be the upper Republican River Basin, and then the area between Nebraska City and Falls City. Of course, that's the Missouri River Basin, and across northern Missouri is where we're expecting some significant issues as we go through the spring season.
And then real quick, current status of the snowpack in the upper Platte River, and what does this mean for flows east of Lake McConaughey?
We watch the Platte rather significantly in terms of its oyster issues. Right now, between 112 and 116% of normal between the South and the North Platte Basin. Projected flows this summer, 102 to 103% of normal, and that's considering normal precipitation. So as long as it doesn't get aggressively wet this spring, we should escape this in relatively good shape.
Thanks again to Al for stopping by and talking about flooding. Next up, we know how important your bottom line is, and if you can find a way to save a buck here and there, you'd be wise to do so. Nebraska Extension educator Robert Tigner joined me to talk about some of his favorite ways to stretch your cash flow on the farm. One thing you talk about, cancel or renegotiate leases that are unprofitable. How does one decide which decision is best on that front?
Well, some of that has to do with communication with their current landowners. The tenant needs to understand their landowner well and have a good communication avenue with that landowner. If there's a farmer that has just recently retired and is renting that land to a new tenant, they probably have a good understanding that there's a lot of risk in today's agricultural environment. But if there's 2 or 3 generations removed from that operation of that land, it's more difficult for those tenants to communicate well with the landowners. They have to have real good communication with their landowner, though, to figure out which one is the better process. If they haven't canceled that cash rental agreement or that rental agreement by the 1st of September, they are locked in unless the landowner is going to allow them to renegotiate.
And you also mentioned defer capital asset purchases. What are some things to consider there?
Well, some of those things to consider is which is going to be more cash conserving for them. Sometimes it is more cash conserving to actually buy a new machine or a used machine or have it rented from an operation or have custom operations done for them than to own their current machinery line. Sometimes it's more useful to get rid of those repair costs and be able to use newer equipment, newer machinery, but you have to know what each cost is for both of those operations. If you don't know what those are, you must figure that out.
Okay, so another thing you mentioned, utilize FSA guaranteed loans. So how do you get those loans and where would someone learn more about that?
Well, that's the Farm Service Agency. So the first place to go is to set up an appointment and visit with the loan officers at your nearest FSA office. Sometimes those might be a ways away, but you'll always be able to contact them. Those guaranteed loans allow the lender, your current lender, financial lender, to lend you funds at less risk. That's what the guarantee is all about. It's similar to an FHA loan, Farmers Home Administration loan for homeowners loans and things like that.
And they have the low interest marketing loans too, right?
Yeah, one thing to really consider, and hasn't been done by a lot of farmers recently, is whether or not to put their owned or their stored grain under loan. A CCC or a conservation loan that would give them still access to gaining appreciation in that grain price, as well as cash to pay off operating notes or to pay off costs for inputs that they will have for this year.
And you also mentioned sometimes it's best to sell assets that aren't earning their keep. Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yes, when I was farming, it's those extra tractors that you have sitting around that you really never use, but you kind of like to have them around just in case. You know, maybe they're a collector item or whatever, something like that. Or maybe it's that spare combine, those, or you have machinery left over from switching from conventional till to strip till. That extra machinery needs to be sold someplace so that it no longer becomes an asset sink for you.
And are there any other tips that we didn't specifically talk about but that you'd still like to mention?
Well, one thing that really needs to be considered by farm families is to develop a family living budget. That budget is extremely important to stick to because it's easy for us to spend money on things that maybe are not in the budget. If we stick to the budget, we will have better control of our cash flow. The same can be said for the farm operation itself. Develop a projected cash flow and stick to that budget and track how well you are doing with sticking to that cash flow document that you've prepared. It helps you plan rather than react to situations.
Thanks to Robert for those tips. Definitely learned something there. Finally today, grain marketing is sometimes confusing and often daunting. Nebraska Extension educator Jessica Groskopf has a name for the anxiety you feel about marketing grain. She calls it the marketing mind game. She came by the show to offer some tips.
I think this has been a really interesting year for the grain markets. We had a really interesting summer as we watched the trade war with China unfold, and now the market has kind of been sitting stagnant since harvest and really hasn't had a whole lot of movement, which we normally expect after the first of the year. So I think there is a little bit of anxiety as we're trying to see what the market is really going to give us this year, and that does cause some anxiety. You know, if you put grain in the bin unpriced, it's kind of been, especially the corn market, has been moving sideways and flat. And so, you know, how do you determine what the best move is for your operation? And that does, you know, kind of get in your head a little bit about whether or not you made the correct decision putting it in the bin unpriced.
And you have some things that we can do to reduce that anxiety, and that probably starts with being satisfied with the decisions you've made and not beating yourself up about it too much.
Yeah, so when I talk to farmers, you know, they always say, boy, I wish I would have, or I made the wrong move. And really, when we talk about grain marketing, there aren't wrong moves. We all make grain marketing decisions for various reasons, and when we make those decisions, as long as we made them for solid reasons, either stopping storage or not having the logistics to move that crop later in the year, whatever it might be, we have to be satisfied with those decisions, even if they didn't result in the highest price possible when we took that grain to the elevator.
And there's so much information out there, some might even say information overload. What can we do in that regard?
What I like to tell producers is to find 2 or 3 trusted sources of information and just follow those 2 or 3 sources. If you're listening to every market expert out there, you're probably getting mixed signals. So find those 2 or 3 that you really relate with, that you understand and that you trust, and that way you're not overloaded by market information.
And I would think it's probably important to be realistic about the market too, right?
Absolutely. This year we've been talking to farmers, and the comment that comes out of their mouth pretty often is, if corn was just $4, and having that expectation, it might get there. But in terms of cash price, I don't think that opportunity, if it exists, is going to exist for very long. So having that realistic price target is really important, because I could be making some solid sales right now at $3.60, and that would be a good opportunity for me to lock in some profit for that corn that will be harvested this coming year.
And finally, you talk about writing a grain marketing plan. This seems like a really big one to me.
Yeah, I'm surprised at the number of producers who haven't actually sat down and wrote a grain marketing plan. And that plan should include both date targets as well as price targets. And that really helps you walk through the marketing process and set some goals, so that when you see or you hear what the current price is, you have something solid to gauge that price against. And also understanding and thinking through, is that a good price? Is that a good basis value? Is that a good futures value? And what type of action did I say I was going to take when I saw that price? So having that grain marketing plan written out is a really great way to make good decisions and not regret the decisions that you've made.
It's all about making those good decisions. Thanks again to Jessica for coming on the show. That's going to do it for this week's episode. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. Until then, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.